Her new daughter-in-law called her low class, loud enough for the wedding photographer to flinch. Maggie Lawson, retired consultant and mother of the groom, didn't react. Vanessa smiled for the cameras, secure in her illusion. By the end of the month, her fake fortune, rented estate, and fragile reputation would unravel, silently, methodically, and without Maggie ever raising her voice. She didn't need to scream, she had receipts. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The chandeliers above the country club ballroom shimmered like captured stars, scattering light across polished marble and crystal flutes. The string quartet played a softened rendition of Can't Help Falling in Love, its notes almost drowned by the hum of conversation and clinking silverware. Maggie Lawson stood near the edge of the dance floor, her hands folded loosely around a glass of sparkling water. Never champagne at weddings, she always said. She caught the faintest whisper over the music. Vanessa's voice, sharp, breathy, coated with honey, leaned toward one of her bridesmaids. "She's so low class," Vanessa murmured, the words slicing through the melody. Maggie didn't move, didn't flinch. Her expression held the same pleasant calm she'd practiced for years in boardrooms and client dinners. From a distance, she looked serene, a proud mother of the groom enjoying the evening. Only her pulse betrayed her. Lucas stood a few feet away, laughing with Vanessa's father, oblivious. Her son had never been good at noticing what people said when they thought no one was listening. Maggie's eyes wandered across the tables. Linen in soft ivory, gold-rimmed plates, towering floral arrangements dripping in white roses. The whole thing screamed overcompensation. Even the scent. Too many perfumes, too much money trying to smell expensive. She watched the way Vanessa's mother adjusted a faux pearl necklace, smiling with the relief of someone whose daughter had married up, not across. Her phone buzzed. A text from Pat Green. "Don't let it slide." Maggie exhaled slowly, her lips curving into a faint smile. Of course, Pat had caught it too. Nothing escaped that woman. But no, tonight wasn't for retaliation. Not yet. Tonight was for observation. She lifted her glass, taking a small sip of water that had long gone lukewarm. Every swallow steadied her. Every inhale rewound the sting into something she could control, fold, and later, weaponize. Across the room, Vanessa was in full performance mode, posing for photos, head tilted just enough to flash the diamond earrings Maggie suspected were cubic zirconia. Maggie cataloged it all, not from spite, but from habit. Years of consulting had taught her that people revealed themselves in their details, the unguarded tone, the careless brag, the truth peeking from behind a well-rehearsed story. She noted how Vanessa spoke to the waitstaff, smiling just until they turned their backs. How she corrected one of the bridesmaids for mispronouncing a wine label, how she slipped the photographer an extra bill to make sure we only get the flattering shots. Every act a record, every lie a future opportunity. Pat caught her eye from across the ballroom, raised an eyebrow, and mouthed, "You okay?" Maggie nodded once, steady, the kind of nod that said, "I heard, I remember, and I'll decide when it matters." When Lucas and Vanessa took to the dance floor for their first dance, the crowd swayed in admiration. Cameras flashed. Maggie clapped politely, the proud mother on the outside, her mind already moving like a chessboard. She could feel the old instincts sharpening, the ones she hadn't needed since retirement. Low class. The words replayed like a splinter in her memory, precise and cutting. Funny thing about insults, they could sound small in the moment, yet they settled deep, waiting. As the dance ended, Maggie excused herself from her table, weaving through the crowd toward the hallway leading to the powder room. The noise softened behind her. In the mirror, the reflection that stared back wasn't frail or fragile. 69, yes, but not diminished. Her posture straight, her gaze cool. The woman staring back wasn't someone to pity. She took out her phone and scrolled to a private note she'd kept for years, simply titled, "Things I Don't Forget." She added one line beneath it. October 12th, 7:54 p.m. Vanessa Carlton. She's so low class. Then she locked her phone, reapplied her lipstick, and stepped back into the noise and light of the reception, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. When she returned to the ballroom, Vanessa was greeting another cluster of guests, laughter ringing a little too loud, a little too forced. Maggie crossed the room, her heels soundless against the marble, and paused by the dessert table, pretending to admire the layered cake. Vanessa didn't even notice her standing there, too busy performing wealth she didn't have. Maggie took another sip of water and let the bubbles sting her tongue. She felt the shift inside her, the precise moment patience began to turn into resolve. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The Monday after the wedding, Charlotte's early light spilled through Maggie Lawson's kitchen windows. Cool, golden, deliberate. The scent of brewed coffee drifted across polished granite. Everything in her home, from the oak cabinetry to the silver picture frames on the counter, was understated and genuine. No pretense, no performance. Maggie scrolled through her laptop, her fingers steady on the trackpad. County property records were public, predictable, and, when you knew where to look, brutally honest. Vanessa Carlton, search. Carlton Family Estate, search. She sipped her coffee, eyes narrowing as the screen filled with results. The Carlton Estate, which Vanessa had proudly described as a family heirloom stretching back to 3 generations, was leased. Not just leased. Leased to an out-of-state LLC, owned by a real estate group that handled high-end rentals for influencers and short-term tenants. Maggie's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Of course. She clicked deeper, downloading copies of filings, mortgage statements, tax histories, lease agreements. Years of consulting had left her fluent in the language of money. The paper trail told its own story. Vanessa's family had moved frequently, never holding property longer than 2 years. Every investment was a mirage built on credit. Her phone buzzed. Patricia Green's name lit up the screen. "Morning," Maggie answered. "I couldn't sleep," Pat said. "That woman's voice is still in my head calling you low class, so I started digging." Maggie leaned back in her chair. "Tell me." "I checked the local bank records from their supposed estate. Turns out her daddy took out 2 personal loans last year. One to cover some kind of renovation, another just labeled wedding-related expenses." Pat's tone sharpened. "They've been living off extensions and card advances." Maggie nodded slowly, jotting notes in the corner of a yellow legal pad. "So the legacy she keeps bragging about is rented, financed on fumes." "Smoke and mirrors," Pat said. "The only thing they own outright is the fantasy." Maggie smiled faintly, twirling her pen. "That, my dear, is exactly what people like her underestimate, how easy it is to verify what's real." Across town, Lucas was probably back at his downtown office, oblivious as always. She pictured him there, tie loosened, sleeves rolled, fielding calls with that easy charm that made him popular but not perceptive. He'd never been interested in where money came from, just that it was there. That evening, Maggie organized the documents into neat digital folders. Property, loans, tax records, statements. She labeled the main directory simply Carlton Reality. She printed hard copies, slid them into a manila envelope, and tucked it into her desk drawer beneath her estate documents. Her eyes lingered on the label, and a quiet satisfaction flickered in her chest. Not gloating, just confirmation. The following day, she met Patricia for lunch at a quiet bistro uptown. The kind of place that didn't take selfies for Instagram or drown in champagne flutes. Pat sipped her tea and leaned across the table. So what's next? You planning to drop this on her doorstep? Maggie stirred a packet of sugar into her coffee. Not yet. That would give her control of the narrative. People like Vanessa thrive on drama. They twist it into sympathy. Pat smirked. So you'll let her hang herself first. Something like that, Maggie said softly. She built a story. I'll let the truth unravel it on its own. Pat tapped her spoon against the rim of her cup. You always were the long game type. Maggie met her friend's gaze. And the patient type. That night, after Patricia dropped her off, Maggie sat in her quiet study with the envelope on her lap. The city outside her window pulsed with life. Cars on wet asphalt, the faint echo of laughter from a nearby rooftop bar. Maggie opened a new document on her computer and titled it, Public Reveal, Draft Plan. She began typing bullet points, subtle ways to let the facts surface without her fingerprints. A conversation here, a forwarded email there. Maybe an anonymous tip to a local columnist who adored society gossip meets reality check pieces. She worked until midnight, the blue light from her screen casting sharp shadows across the room. Each keystroke was deliberate, methodical, a measured response to a single whispered insult. Before she shut the laptop, she glanced once more at the envelope resting beside her. The top corner was marked in her tidy handwriting, verification complete. She slipped it back into her drawer, turned off the lamp, and stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the soft tick of the wall clock. Tomorrow, she'd see Lucas for lunch. He'd smile, talk about his honeymoon plans, and never once suspect that his mother already knew the truth about the woman he'd married. Maggie reached for her phone and sent one last message to Pat. Phase 1. Confirmed. She's not who she says she is. Then she set the phone down, the faintest trace of satisfaction crossing her face. The game had begun. By the time Maggie arrived at the Charlotte Country Club that Thursday, the air already carried the faint hum of post-wedding exhaustion. Staff were packing up leftover decor, crystal vases, silk drapes, and boxes of unused favors that had been ordered in excess. Maggie had been invited by the venue manager to review the billing details. Her son's signature had somehow ended up attached to several of Vanessa's special upgrades. She signed in at the front desk with her usual calm poise. The young receptionist, barely 20, gave a polite smile that faltered when she noticed the name on the clipboard. Oh, Mrs. Lawson. Yes, we were told you might come by. Mrs. Carlton left. Quite a list of requests. I'm sure she did, Maggie said pleasantly, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. I just want to make sure everything was properly settled. The receptionist's relief was palpable. You might want to speak with the event coordinator, Miss Jennings. She had concerns. Within minutes, Maggie was escorted to a back office where a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on her head was sorting through invoices. I remember you, the woman said, smiling. Mother of the groom. Lovely wedding. Maggie offered her hand. Lovely, yes. Just not necessarily modest. Miss Jennings exhaled through her nose, chuckling. That's one way to put it. We tried to explain that imported orchids and Swarovski table numbers weren't part of the base package. Mrs. Carlton insisted her family would cover it. She lowered her voice. Except they didn't. Maggie arched a brow. They didn't. The woman shook her head, sliding a folder across the table. Half the payments came through last-minute wire transfers from 3 different credit cards. 2 bounced and had to be reprocessed. Maggie skimmed the paperwork with detached precision, her expression neutral. Do you mind if I take a photo of this summary for my records? Of course, ma'am. It's public invoice data, nothing confidential. She raised her phone, capturing quick, silent images. No flash, no fuss, just facts. As she walked through the emptied ballroom afterward, she overheard 2 caterers chatting quietly by the exit doors. Can you believe her mom asked if she could pay an exposure for next time? One laughed. The other snorted. Old money, my ass. That family didn't even tip half the staff. Maggie didn't interrupt. She simply kept walking, her heels clicking softly across the marble floor as she glanced around the lavish space that had hosted the insult. The same chandeliers glittered overhead, but now they seemed colder, more clinical. She stepped out onto the terrace, where sunlight spilled across the trimmed lawns. Pulling her phone from her bag, she snapped a few photos of the setup being dismantled, the rented linens, the floral arches already wilting, the faint scuff marks on the marble where the dance floor had been, evidence of extravagance that couldn't sustain itself. Her phone buzzed. A message from Pat. Keep receipts, pictures, everything. People like her rewrite the story when the bill shows up. Maggie typed back a simple thumbs up, then tucked the phone away. Later that afternoon, she met with Edward Hargrove in his office downtown, a space lined with heavy books and muted confidence. He greeted her with a knowing look as she slid the printed invoice photos across his desk. She claimed her family paid for everything, Maggie said, but the venue confirms otherwise. And these bounced payments suggest financial misrepresentation. Edward examined the images. This is good documentation. Nothing invasive, all public or transactional. Perfectly safe to reference later if needed. He leaned back, thoughtful. You're building this case as if you were preparing for court. Maggie gave a faint, satisfied smile. Habit. Old habits never retire, Edward. He chuckled quietly. Just be careful. The goal isn't to humiliate, it's to reveal. Cleanly. I know, she said softly. The truth speaks for itself. Back at home that evening, Maggie poured herself a rare glass of champagne, the good kind, from a bottle she'd kept since her retirement celebration. The bubbles rose and shimmered in the glass as she stood by her window, watching the city's skyline burn orange against the sunset. She thought of Vanessa's performance, the pearls, the posture, the practiced condescension, and of how fragile it all was once the curtain lifted. Pat had once told her that revenge was best served cold. Maggie disagreed. It was best served carefully, slow enough for everyone to realize the taste was truth. She raised the glass in a quiet toast to herself, savoring the sting of effervescence. Then her phone buzzed once more, a notification from the club's billing office. An attached message read, Mrs. Lawson, just confirming, Mrs. Carlton's parents requested your address today for invoice adjustments. Should we share it? Maggie's smile didn't fade, but her eyes sharpened. She set the champagne flute down and typed back. No, I'll reach out to them directly. The following Saturday, the Carlton Lawson wedding afterglow lingered across Charlotte's upper-crust social circle. Photos from the reception had started circulating, filtered, brightened, captioned with hashtags like old money elegance, and Carlton tradition. Maggie saw them while scrolling over morning coffee, her expression unmoved. The comment sections told a different story than reality. Such a beautiful family, one read. Love the classic Southern heritage, another chimed. Maggie clicked on one post and found a familiar name, Vanessa, gushing about her family's century-old estate hosting dignitaries. She almost laughed, the gall of it. By mid-morning, Maggie was at Patricia's house. The place smelled of lavender and lemon oil, the air crisp with quiet competence. Pat sat at her breakfast table, laptop open, reading aloud from a local society blog. They've got Vanessa listed as the daughter of the Carlton manufacturing dynasty, she said with a scoff. There hasn't been a Carlton manufacturer in North Carolina since 1989. Maggie took a slow sip of her tea. People believe what looks polished. Truth doesn't trend. It endures. Pat grinned. That's poetic. But are we going to let this circus go on? Not for long, Maggie said, Edward's drafting something for me. As if on cue, her phone chimed. A new message from Edward. Letter ready for review. Come by when convenient. At his office downtown, sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting clean stripes across the oak desk. Edward handed over a cream envelope stamped with his firm's seal. Inside was a neatly worded statement, a clarification of financial and property facts concerning the Carltons' assets, drafted in precise legal tone, dry, irrefutable, and devastatingly polite. It wasn't accusation, it was correction. I've included the relevant public record citations, Edward explained. Anyone reading this will understand the facts without you having to say a word. Maggie read every line twice. No malice, no embellishment, just truth dressed in courtesy. She nodded. Perfect, controlled, professional, verifiable. Edward studied her face. You realize this letter could circulate fast once it's seen. Gossip spreads faster than law. That's fine, Maggie said, sliding the envelope back into its folder. Let it spread, but on my timing. That evening, she and Pat met at a quiet rooftop lounge, their usual corner table tucked away from the crowd. The city glowed below, buildings flickering like embers against a mauve horizon. Pat scrolled through her phone. I've got 3 guests from the wedding posting nonsense about Southern lineage, she said. What if those posts suddenly attract factual context? Maggie smiled faintly. Subtle, Patricia. Always subtle. Pat nodded, her fingers moving quickly. Within minutes, a few anonymous accounts began commenting on the wedding posts with polite but precise facts. Public record screenshots, historical registry links, all verifiable. No insults. Just quiet correction. By the time they finished their drinks, those comments had begun to draw curiosity. Replies trickled in. Wait, really? And that estate's rented? Maggie leaned back, satisfied. Let them discover it themselves. Discovery feels more authentic than accusation. Pat lifted her glass. To the truth, then. To the truth, Maggie echoed, their glasses clinking gently in the twilight. Later, at home, Maggie sat in her study reviewing her growing archive. The folder Carlton Reality had evolved into subfolders: invoices, loans, public records, statements, images. Each document neatly labeled, time-stamped, cross-checked. She reviewed the materials with the same precision she once used for corporate audits. Her printer hummed softly as she printed copies for Edward's file. The rhythm steadied her, the sound of quiet control. As she organized the stack, her doorbell rang. It was Lucas. He looked relaxed, cheerful, oblivious. Hey, Mom. Vanessa and I just got back from the mountains. Thought I'd stop by. Maggie smiled warmly. Of course, sweetheart. Come in. He followed her to the kitchen, chatting about his honeymoon, the views, the food. Maggie poured him a drink, listening, observing the light ease in his face. She's something, huh? Lucas said proudly. Vanessa's parents are even talking about bringing me into some of their family business ventures. Are they? Maggie asked softly, her tone careful. Yeah, they've got some heritage investments up north. She said her grandfather founded one of the oldest textile companies in the state. He laughed. I mean, she's got history, Mom. Maggie kept her eyes on the glass in her hand, watching the condensation trail down its side. She smiled faintly. Yes, Lucas. History has a way of revealing itself. He didn't notice the double meaning. After he left, she sat for a long moment at the table, the silence pressing in like velvet. Her son's laughter still lingered faintly in the air, pure, trusting, unaware. Maggie opened her laptop again, her fingers poised over the keyboard. The social media murmurs were already shifting, friends whispering, acquaintances questioning, little threads of doubt weaving themselves into Vanessa's carefully constructed image. The timing was right. The next phase would not be reaction, it would be revelation. She closed the laptop slowly, the corners of her mouth lifting into the calm, deliberate smile of someone who knew precisely what storm she was about to let loose. The evening hum of laughter and clinking glasses filled the ballroom once more. 2 weeks after the wedding, the newlyweds hosted a thank you reception at the Carlton family's rented estate, an event meant to display wealth and gratitude in equal measure. The home looked impressive under the soft glow of rented chandeliers. But Maggie saw the details others missed: the scuffed molding beneath the drapes, the faint mildew at the edges of the ornate fountain, the worn rugs trying to pass for heirlooms. She stood near the center of the hall, her champagne flute reflecting gold light. Vanessa glided through the crowd in a cream cocktail dress, her laugh bright and practiced, greeting guests as if she'd been born to host soirees. Maggie noted how her daughter-in-law's smile faltered slightly each time she caught sight of her. Patricia appeared beside Maggie, a calm presence in navy silk. "She's playing hostess on borrowed ground," Pat murmured, eyes scanning the room. "Let her," Maggie replied softly. "Every stage needs its final act." Edward stood by the buffet table, scanning the room with quiet precision. When Maggie caught his eye, he gave a subtle nod. Everything was ready: the documents, the confirmations, the timing. When the band paused and the soft murmur of the crowd shifted, Lucas took the microphone. "Before we wrap up tonight, I want to thank everyone for coming," he said warmly. "It means so much to Vanessa and me to celebrate with family and friends." Applause rippled through the room. Then, smiling, Lucas turned toward his mother. "And I think my mom wanted to say a few words too. Right, Mom?" For a moment, the air seemed to still. Vanessa's smile stiffened. Maggie's fingers brushed the stem of her glass. "Of course, dear." She stepped forward slowly, every movement deliberate. "Thank you, everyone," she began, her tone gracious and calm. "I just wanted to take a moment to say how proud I am of my son, and of the beautiful life he and Vanessa are building together." Vanessa relaxed slightly, nodding, though her eyes remained wary. Maggie turned toward the guests, her voice even. "It's been lovely getting to know Vanessa's family and learning more about their history. The Carltons have such fascinating roots. I did a bit of reading. Just curiosity, you know." Soft laughter fluttered around the room. "I was amazed to learn," Maggie continued, "that the so-called Carlton estate where we stand tonight has such a unique history. The property's gone through several owners, and I understand it's now managed by a private trust. Quite exclusive." Across the room, a few heads tilted. Murmurs began to whisper between the tables. Maggie smiled faintly, keeping her tone conversational. "It's remarkable how history weaves itself through different hands. I even found an old tax record from just last year. Shows the trust took over maintenance when, well, some of the original owners had to step away." Patricia's phone buzzed quietly in her hand. She gave a barely perceptible nod, phase one in motion. Discreetly, she began forwarding select photos and records to a handful of key guests. Nothing inflammatory, just confirmations, the kind that spoke louder than any accusation. Vanessa's face had drained of color. "Maggie," she said through a smile stretched too thin, "maybe this isn't—" But Maggie's tone was still soft, pleasant. "Oh, don't worry, dear. It's all public information. I found it fascinating, truly. I think everyone appreciates knowing a bit of authenticity behind all this beauty." A hush settled, broken only by the faint hum of a nearby chandelier. Guests exchanged uncertain glances. Someone near the front whispered, "Did she say it's rented?" Lucas's confusion was instant. "Mom, what are you talking about?" he asked quietly, microphone still in hand. Maggie turned to him, gentle. Just sharing a few truths, sweetheart. Transparency is always good for a marriage. Vanessa's hands trembled around her glass. That's enough, she hissed, voice cracking. Edward stepped forward slightly from his post near the buffet, his calm expression signaling quiet assurance. Legal safety. All facts, no defamation. Maggie could continue freely if she chose. Patricia's phone buzzed again. The guests who'd received the forwarded records were now whispering among themselves, showing screens, pointing discreetly. Someone murmured, "That estate isn't theirs?" Another replied, "But she said her grandfather built it." The current of gossip spread fast and soundless, the way fire moves under dry leaves. Maggie's toast concluded simply, her words a velvet blade. "To Lucas and Vanessa," she said, raising her glass, "may their foundation always rest on truth." A scattered applause followed, hesitant, uncertain. Vanessa's face was tight, eyes glassy, her composure slipping by the second. Lucas stood frozen beside her, looking from his wife to his mother, lost between disbelief and dawning realization. Maggie took a slow sip of her champagne, her expression serene. She didn't need to say another word. The room was already unraveling the rest for her. As she lowered her glass, she caught Patricia's gaze across the room. Pat's subtle nod was all it took. Within minutes, photos of the estate's real records were circulating quietly through group texts and whispered side conversations. The Carlton dynasty had begun to fracture before the last toast even ended. Vanessa's trembling voice finally broke through the murmur. You had no right." Maggie's eyes met hers, calm and measured. "I had every right, dear. You gave me the stage." The fallout from the reception spread faster than either side could contain it. Within a week, whispers had reached every circle that once fawned over the Carlton name. Invitations slowed, calls went unanswered, and by the following Thursday, Vanessa's signature sparkle had dulled into something brittle. Maggie watched it all unfold from a distance, never gloating, never commenting. Her silence, she knew, carried more weight than any public retort. It was mid-morning when she walked into the main branch of Queen City Bank, the place she'd trusted for decades. The air smelled faintly of paper and espresso, the kind of scent that made ordinary people nervous. Clara Kim, the branch manager, met her with a professional smile that softened into familiarity. "Mrs. Lawson," Clara greeted warmly, "I got your message. You wanted to verify some financial claims?" Maggie nodded, following her into a private conference room. "Yes, a delicate matter. Family-related. I'd like to confirm a few things discreetly." Clara closed the door. "Understood. I've already reviewed the preliminary documents you sent over from Mr. Hargrove's office." Maggie settled into the leather chair, opening a slim folder of notes. Vanessa Carlton Lawson and her parents, Jeffrey and Linda Carlton. They've mentioned holding several investments through this bank. I'd like to confirm the nature of those accounts. Clara turned her monitor toward Maggie, her tone careful. "What I can share, within compliance, is that there are active accounts, but they're not as represented." She clicked through a few tabs. "The balances fluctuate drastically, heavy withdrawals, repeated short-term loans. And there's a mortgage. Two, actually. One for a condo in Atlanta, another for this so-called family estate." Maggie leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. "Mortgaged, not owned." Clara nodded. "To the penny. The title's under a shell company, but the financing still routes through their personal credit. High interest. Late fees." Maggie felt a faint, measured satisfaction, not the giddy thrill of revenge, but the quiet confirmation of a pattern. "Thank you, Clara. This is exactly what I needed." "Would you like me to print a verification statement for Mr. Hargrove's review?" Clara asked. "Yes, please. Keep it concise. No commentary. Facts only." As Clara typed, the door to the conference room opened slightly. A hesitant voice drifted in. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know this room was in use." Vanessa. She stood in the doorway, dressed impeccably as always, but the confidence had cracked. Her smile was tight, her eyes wide with polite confusion masking fear. "Mrs. Lawson? I didn't realize you banked here." Maggie turned slowly, her face an immaculate portrait of composure. "Of course. I've been a client for over 30 years." Vanessa glanced toward the screen Clara had just minimized. "I see. Well, I was just here to discuss some, personal transactions." Her voice wavered just enough for Maggie to notice. "How convenient," Maggie said softly, folding her hands on the table. "It seems our paths cross everywhere lately." Vanessa hesitated. "You're not looking into my family's accounts, are you?" Maggie's tone was smooth, almost kind. "I don't look into anyone's affairs, dear. Facts simply have a way of appearing when one is paying attention." The younger woman's expression flickered, caught between indignation and dread. She forced a small laugh. "Well, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. My father handles everything." Clara handed Maggie a sealed envelope. "Here's the verification you requested, Mrs. Lawson." "Thank you, Clara." Maggie rose gracefully, adjusting the sleeve of her blazer. "I'll have Edward review this for accuracy." As she passed Vanessa, she paused, her perfume faint but deliberate. Something elegant, subtle, unshakable. "Do take care, Vanessa," she murmured, just loud enough for only her to hear. Paper trails have longer memories than people. The color drained from Vanessa's face. Outside, the air was crisp and clear. Patricia was waiting in her car across the street, engine idling, sunglasses low on her nose. "Well?" she asked as Maggie slipped into the passenger seat. "Confirmed," Maggie said simply. "The wealth is fiction. Loans, mortgages, and wishful thinking." Pat let out a low whistle. "I almost feel sorry for her." "Don't," Maggie replied, her voice calm but iron-edged. "She built her kingdom on credit. I'm just shining a light on the debt." They drove toward Edward's office in comfortable silence. Maggie's reflection in the car window looked serene, even regal. Beneath the calm, though, her mind was already assembling the next move. How to transition from quiet revelation to irrefutable exposure. When they arrived, Edward was already waiting with his sleeves rolled up and the same calm focus that matched Maggie's own. She handed him the sealed envelope. He skimmed its contents, nodding. "Clean data, legally airtight." "Good," Maggie said. "No one can claim fabrication when the truth is straight from the bank." As they finalized the documentation, Patricia stood by the window, watching a familiar figure outside. Vanessa, pacing the sidewalk, her phone pressed to her ear, panic written across every gesture. "She's rattled," Pat said softly. Maggie joined her, following the movement with quiet satisfaction. "She should be." Lies unravel quickest when they reach the bank. Edward smiled faintly. "I assume this means phase 2 begins?" Maggie turned away from the window, eyes cool and clear. "Not yet," she said. "First, I'll let her realize just how far the truth can travel without me saying a single word." The next few days passed with deceptive calm. Charlotte's sky hung low and gray, like it knew something was brewing. Maggie sat at her dining table, sunlight filtering through gauzy curtains, a thick folder spread before her. The documents lay in perfect order: contracts, property titles, loan statements, each one labeled in her meticulous handwriting. She ran a finger along the embossed seal on the top page of the Carlton estate lease. Her lips pressed into a faint smile. It was all there. Every clause Vanessa and her parents had likely skimmed, every condition they hadn't truly understood. "Read before you sign," she whispered to herself, remembering the advice she'd given clients for years, advice the Carltons clearly hadn't taken. Her phone buzzed. Patricia's message popped up. "How's the archive coming?" Maggie replied. "Complete, everything verified." Pat's next message arrived seconds later. "Then it's time for the soft drop." Maggie agreed, but hers wouldn't be loud or brash. Truth didn't need a parade, it needed a whisper at the right table. By late afternoon, she was at Edward's office again, the city humming faintly outside the tall windows. He looked up from his desk as she entered, the same half smile on his face. "I take it you've finished your verification," he said. "I have. Every number aligns, every signature authentic. Their financial scaffolding is real, just hollow." She handed him the folder. "You'll see the cross-references. Mortgages disguised as inheritance. Renovation loans disguised as legacy." Edward leafed through the pages, nodding. "Perfect. And still within legal transparency. If any of this surfaces, no one can accuse you of leaking it." "That's the beauty," Maggie said. "I don't have to say a word." That evening, while the city turned gold and indigo, Maggie poured herself a glass of water and sat in her study. Her laptop glowed faintly in the darkened room. Vanessa's social media had lit up again. She was trying to retake control of the story. Photos flooded the feed. Vanessa at a country club luncheon beside a local judge's wife, a caption bragging about family partnerships. Another image of her posing near a Rolls-Royce that wasn't hers. Maggie recognized the parking lot. The same club where Vanessa's father had defaulted on membership dues 3 months earlier. The performative gloss was back, desperate and loud. But now, people were looking closer. The comments weren't fawning anymore. A few polite questions slipped in. Wasn't that car a rental? Thought the estate was owned by a trust? Vanessa hadn't noticed the shift yet, but Maggie had. The next morning, she invited Lucas over for coffee. He arrived looking tired, tie askew, eyes wary. He took his usual seat at the kitchen island, the one he'd claimed since college, the one where he'd once confessed he hated confrontation. "Mornin', Mom," he said softly. Maggie slid a mug toward him. "Cream and sugar are there." He hesitated before speaking again. "Vanessa says people are talking about her family. She's upset." "I'm sure she is," Maggie replied gently, stirring her own cup. "But Lucas, sometimes the truth has a way of introducing itself whether we invite it or not." He frowned. "Did you have something to do with this?" Her eyes lifted to meet his. "Lucas, I have something to do with keeping facts straight. Not gossip." He looked away, guilt written across his face. "I just wish people would stop speculating." "They will," Maggie said quietly. "When the truth settles, speculation ends." The conversation drifted into uneasy silence. He changed the subject, but the tension stayed between them like static. After he left, Maggie made a few selective calls to relatives, a former colleague who managed a community trust, and one of her late husband's golfing friends, who happened to sit on the board of the same country club Vanessa so often name-dropped. She didn't share anything private, only small factual corrections, laced with gracious concern. By the end of the day, the whispers had evolved into something sharper, more curious. Guests from the wedding began texting one another quietly, pulling threads. "Didn't Vanessa say her family owned half that bank? Strange. Because my cousin works there. Says it's not true." Meanwhile, Vanessa kept posting, smiling too wide, tagging too many people. Her captions were defiant. "So proud of my heritage and everything my family built." But each new post drew more questions than applause. Patricia called that evening, voice half amused, half amazed. "You're not even doing anything and she's unraveling herself." "I told you," Maggie said, sipping her tea. "All it takes is truth and time." Pat chuckled. "And a well-placed receipt or two." Maggie smiled. "Always." As she hung up, she returned to her study. Her documents sat neatly stacked on her desk, untouched but ready. The faint hum of her computer filled the room. She ran a fingertip over the label of the newest folder. Phase 2. Social Reality. She didn't need to post, announce, or boast. She only needed to wait. The game wasn't over. It was entering its most delicate stage. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows ever so slightly, like a quiet warning that the storm she'd set in motion was finally gathering. By Monday morning, the temperature in Charlotte had dropped, but the city's social scene was burning with quiet speculation. Vanessa's name, once murmured with admiration, now carried an edge of doubt. Her posts continued: bright smiles, flawless dresses, carefully staged luxury, but to Maggie's eye, every image reeked of desperation. At precisely 9 a.m., Maggie met Edward and Patricia at his office downtown. Edward's conference room was immaculate: oak table, leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the skyline. The tone was clinical, not conspiratorial. Maggie liked that. Truth, she believed, should always look professional. Patricia set a folder on the table. Everything we gathered from the venue, the bank, and the contracts, printed, time-stamped, and cross-checked. Edward adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents. Good. We'll keep one full copy here under legal confidentiality. The rest we distribute strategically. Nothing public yet, but enough to ensure credibility if she tries to counterattack. Maggie handed him another envelope. I've added the supplementary evidence. Clara verified each statement. Every number, every signature is real. Edward nodded approvingly. Then we're bulletproof. No defamation, no conjecture, just facts. Pat grinned. In other words, she can't scream slander when it's all from public record. Exactly, Edward said. This is how you reveal rot without touching the tree. Maggie leaned back slightly, her expression calm but calculating. I don't need to cut it down. I just need everyone to see it's hollow. That afternoon, Vanessa hosted a luncheon at the very country club, whose dues her father still hadn't paid. Photos of the event appeared within hours online. Vanessa at the center of a white linen table surrounded by carefully selected guests. The captions were sugary, full of mentions of family tradition and honoring our legacy. Patricia texted Maggie a screenshot with the caption, "She's really doubling down." Maggie replied, "Let her." She didn't comment, didn't share, didn't react. She didn't have to. By early evening, she was home again, reviewing every new post and tag with quiet precision. The algorithm did most of her work for her, linking names, cross-referencing posts, surfacing inconsistencies. A photo Vanessa shared of her grandfather's estate portrait was, in fact, a stock image from an auction site. Maggie recognized the watermark faintly visible at the corner. She smiled to herself. The internet, as always, had a long memory. Meanwhile, Patricia attended the same luncheon's evening cocktail gathering, purely as an observer. She texted Maggie updates from her discreet corner table near the back. She's trying to charm them again. You can feel the tension. People aren't buying it. Her friend Lydia asked about the trust that owns the estate. Vanessa stuttered. Guests whispering near the bar. Someone mentioned tax liens. Maggie read each update in silence, her tea cooling beside her laptop. She didn't need to be there to visualize it. The stiff smiles, the strained laughter, the shallow breaths of a woman losing control of the story she'd written. Then came the final message from Patricia. Lucas just walked in. Maggie froze, thumb hovering over her phone. And, she typed back, he looks uncomfortable. He's hearing it all. Maggie leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. That was the moment she'd been waiting for. Not public humiliation, but quiet awareness. The kind of realization that didn't need explaining, because the truth was already whispering around him. Patricia's next text came minutes later. Vanessa just raised her glass to make a toast, voice trembling. said something about family resilience, it fell flat. Maggie could almost hear it. The forced laughter, the brittle ring of glasses, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. She pictured Lucas standing there, confusion tightening his jaw, eyes darting toward his wife as if trying to reconcile the woman he loved with the one unraveling before him. She closed her laptop, stood, and walked to the window. The city stretched below, its lights flickering like watchful eyes. A new message from Edward appeared. Everything secured. No legal exposure. If she retaliates, the record will protect you. Maggie smiled faintly. Good, she murmured. That's all I ever needed. She glanced at the clock, 8:47 p.m., and imagined Vanessa's party winding down. Guests exchanging polite goodbyes, masks slipping, whispers hardening into conviction. The same people who'd once chased Vanessa's approval were now checking facts on their phones, forwarding articles, sending private messages that began with, "Did you know?" Patricia called just before 9. "It's done," she said quietly. The room turned cold. "Lucas left early. She's unraveling faster than I expected." "Then it's working," Maggie replied. Pat hesitated. "You sure you want him to find out this way?" Maggie looked out at the skyline again, the reflection of her steady eyes in the glass. "He needs to see what trust looks like when it's misplaced." Silence lingered on the line before Patricia spoke again. "He's going to ask you soon." "I know," Maggie said, "and I'll tell him the same thing I told Vanessa. Truth doesn't need permission." Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance, rolling low across the horizon. Maggie drew the curtains closed, her movements slow, deliberate. The storm wasn't here yet, but everyone could feel it coming. The next Saturday, the Carltons hosted what they called a charity appreciation reception, a desperate attempt to reclaim the narrative. The invitation arrived embossed in gold, boasting sponsors who hadn't actually confirmed attendance. Maggie almost declined, but Edward had been clear. Appear once more, calm, composed, unbothered. Let the facts speak in your stead. So she went. The reception was held at a rented hall downtown, dressed up to look like an exclusive gala. String lights hung from exposed beams, an open bar glittered under crystal decanters, and Vanessa stood near the entrance, greeting guests as though nothing had changed. When Maggie entered, conversation faltered. A few heads turned, eyes lowering quickly. Patricia appeared from the crowd, expression composed, but alert. "You ready?" she murmured. Maggie smiled. "Always." Across the room, Vanessa spotted her and froze. It was just a flicker, a tightening around the mouth, but Maggie saw it. Lucas stood beside his wife, trying too hard to look casual. His hand hovered near hers, a gesture that felt more like obligation than affection. Edward arrived moments later, crisp in a charcoal suit, carrying a thin folio tucked under his arm. He nodded once to Maggie, confirmation that everything was in place. Vanessa's voice rang out over the chatter. "Everyone, thank you for coming. We're so honored to support such an important cause. My family has always believed in giving back." Maggie didn't plan to interrupt, but when Vanessa continued, her tone high and artificial, something in the room shifted. Whispers rippled. Names, dates, contradictions. A woman near the back muttered, "Didn't her dad just file a new business loan?" Another man whispered, "That family estate is owned by a rental firm. I looked it up." Maggie caught Edward's subtle glance. It was time. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Vanessa, dear," she began, her voice even and warm. "Would you mind if I shared a few words about the cause?" Vanessa blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, of course, Maggie. Yes, please." Maggie accepted the microphone gracefully. "Thank you," she said, facing the crowd. I just wanted to add a note of appreciation for transparency in charity work. It's vital that donors and organizers alike practice integrity, especially when representing family foundations. A quiet murmur rose through the audience. Vanessa's smile stiffened. Maggie continued smoothly. In fact, I took the liberty of reviewing the listed foundations under the Carlton family name. Oddly enough, I couldn't find any registered under North Carolina or Delaware, though one inactive LLC came close. Gasps fluttered across the room. Someone near the front turned to whisper, "Wait, there's no foundation?" Maggie didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Transparency, she repeated gently, isn't a performance. It's accountability. Edward stepped forward beside her, his tone crisp and legal. For anyone interested, we have verified public documentation available through the county records office. Everything Mrs. Lawson mentioned is fully substantiated. The murmurs deepened, a shifting tide of confusion and realization. Patricia, from her corner of the room, began forwarding the pre-approved evidence packet, a simple PDF of records, stamped and verified, to a few key attendees. Within minutes, phones buzzed quietly across the hall. Vanessa's breath hitched audibly into the microphone. "Maggie, this isn't the time." "Oh, I disagree," Maggie said softly, handing the mic back to her. "It's precisely the time for truth. People deserve to know where their donations and their trust are going." The crowd was silent now. Even the clink of glasses had stopped. Vanessa's face flushed crimson. "This is slander. You've been obsessed with destroying me." Edward spoke evenly. "Public documentation can't slander anyone, Mrs. Lawson Carlton. It only reveals." Maggie turned to Lucas then. He stood pale and motionless, the weight of realization sinking in. "Mom," he said under his breath, voice trembling. "What did you do?" "I told the truth," she said. "You just never wanted to see it." Patricia's phone buzzed again. She looked down, then up at Maggie with a slow, knowing smile. "It's spreading," she whispered. Vanessa snatched her own phone, eyes darting across the screen as messages and notifications poured in. What is this?" she stammered. "Screenshots," Patricia said quietly. "From the guests, from your posts, from your lies." In less than 15 minutes, the whispers had gone digital. Guests were taking pictures of the displayed records, uploading them to social media, captioning them with disbelief. Gar Carlton Gate appeared in the trending feed before the band could start the next song. Vanessa's phone buzzed so rapidly she couldn't keep up. Her face crumpled, fury and panic battling beneath the powder and poise. "You'll regret this," she hissed. But Maggie only smiled, serene. "No, dear, I'll remember it." Lucas turned away, running a hand down his face, his wedding ring catching the light. He didn't say another word. Edward folded his folio calmly. "I think that concludes the evening." Guests began filtering toward the exit, murmuring apologies and excuses, eyes avoiding Vanessa's imploding composure. Patricia leaned in close to Maggie as they stepped aside. "It's all over the feeds. Even the local press is asking for statements." Maggie's gaze stayed on Vanessa, trembling, cornered, still trying to hold her smile. "Let them ask," she said softly. "They'll find all the answers already waiting." The music had stopped hours ago, but the echoes of that night still pulsed through the hall like the aftershock of an earthquake. The crowd had thinned, the chatter replaced by uneasy goodbyes and the quiet clatter of staff collecting half-empty glasses. Maggie sat at a small round table near the edge of the ballroom, the last candle flickering between her and Patricia. The air smelled faintly of champagne and wilted flowers. Pat poured what remained of a bottle into their glasses and lifted hers slightly. "To the truth," she said softly. Maggie's lips curved into a faint smile. to the patience it required. She took a slow sip, the bubbles crisp against her tongue. Around them, the final guests lingered in clusters, some whispering, others pretending not to. It didn't matter anymore. One by one, a few approached her. A silver-haired man from the bank offered a polite nod. "Mrs. Lawson, thank you for the clarification earlier. I had no idea the situation was so complicated." Maggie inclined her head. Complicated things often look simple until they're examined. A woman in pearls touched her shoulder lightly. "It takes courage to speak up like that." Most wouldn't have. "It wasn't courage," Maggie said evenly. "It was necessary." Each conversation ended the same way, with gratitude disguised as curiosity, admiration cloaked in polite restraint. By the time the last of them drifted off, the truth had become the only guest left in the room. Across the hall, Vanessa sat rigid in a shadowed corner, her once perfect posture crumbling. Her phone lay face down on the table, the screen still buzzing with unseen notifications. Lucas stood nearby, hands buried in his pockets, shoulders slumped. Every so often he'd glance toward his mother, then back to his wife. Like a man standing between two versions of reality and realizing neither would save him. Pat watched them from across her glass. He's seeing it all now. Maggie didn't turn her head. He needed to. Vanessa finally rose from her chair, trembling but still clinging to performance. She approached, her voice tight but low. "You humiliated me." Maggie looked up, calm as still water. "You did that to yourself, dear. I simply provided context." "You think you've won something?" Vanessa hissed. "You've made enemies tonight." "I'm old enough not to care about enemies," Maggie replied, voice steady. "I care about legacy. Mine will hold." The younger woman's eyes shimmered with anger and fear. Without another word, she turned sharply and stormed toward the exit, her heels striking hard against the marble. Lucas hesitated, eyes darting between them, then followed silently, his expression hollow. The heavy door closed behind them with a quiet click that sounded almost like a period. For a moment, the silence in the room was absolute. Maggie leaned back in her chair, feeling the strange calm that came after years of being underestimated. It wasn't triumph. It was something deeper, quieter, closure that didn't need applause. Edward crossed the room then, his folio under his arm as always, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Everything's contained," he said, voice low but satisfied. "Every document verified, every citation secure. Even if she tries to claim defamation, she won't have a single angle." "Good," Maggie said. "I don't like loose ends." Pat lifted her glass toward Edward. "To airtight truth." He chuckled softly, accepting the toast. "To airtight truth, and to Mrs. Lawson's precision." Maggie met his gaze with quiet gratitude. Precision is the only thing that outlasts perception. He nodded once, as if committing the line to memory, then excused himself to handle the press inquiries that had already begun trickling in. When the doors finally closed behind him, Maggie and Patricia sat alone again. The chandeliers overhead were dimmed now, their light warm and honeyed, turning the empty hall into something almost tender. Pat sighed contentedly. "You did it, Maggie. You really did it." Maggie swirled the last of her champagne, watching the bubbles spiral and fade. "No," she said softly. "The truth did it. I just gave it room to breathe." They sat in companionable silence, the sound of distant rain beginning to patter against the tall windows. Maggie's thoughts drifted to the years she'd been overlooked at family dinners, dismissed with polite smiles, labeled as practical or old-fashioned. All the while, she'd been building something stronger than flash or vanity. Pat reached across the table, resting a hand on hers. "How does it feel?" Maggie's eyes lifted, steady and reflective. "Peaceful," she said after a moment. But not for them. Outside, the first roll of thunder cracked again, closer this time, sharper, almost cleansing. Maggie stood, smoothing the fabric of her blazer, her poise unbroken. As she turned toward the exit, she paused, looking once more at the empty room. Funny, she murmured, half to herself, how silence feels louder when the pretending stops. Pat smiled faintly, following her out. The storm that had broken over Charlotte that night left the next morning scrubbed clean and silver bright. Maggie sat in her kitchen, the scent of rain still lingering, the city below glinting through a soft haze. On the counter before her lay a leather-bound folder thick with paperwork. Across its cover, embossed in discreet gold letters, was a single word: trust. Edward had scheduled their meeting for noon. By 11:45, Maggie was already seated in his office, a place that always smelled faintly of cedar and certainty. He greeted her with a firm handshake and a reassuring smile. "I've drafted everything we discussed," he said, guiding her toward the long mahogany table where the documents waited. The pages were arranged in perfect order: her estate, investments, properties, charitable foundations, all written in Edward's meticulous legal phrasing. Every clause carried intent like quiet weaponry. Maggie slipped on her reading glasses and began turning pages. "As of these revisions," Edward explained, "the trust will be irrevocable. All claims by Lucas or his spouse are removed, including secondary entitlements." Maggie looked up briefly, her expression composed. "Good. I want clean boundaries. Lucas will inherit only what he earns, not what he's shielded from." Edward nodded, making a note in the margin. "You've redirected the majority to the educational and women's business foundations you helped establish. Patricia Green, co-trustee?" "Yes," Maggie said. "She understands both discretion and justice." Edward smiled faintly. "I'd trust her with mine." The pen in her hand felt heavy but certain as she signed her name across each page. Her signature was neat, unwavering. Years ago, she'd signed contracts worth millions, merger papers, confidentiality agreements, but none had felt this satisfying. This wasn't business. It was legacy management. When they finished, Edward gathered the signed pages into the binder and locked it in his drawer. "That's it," he said. "No one can touch it now. Not Vanessa, not Lucas, not anyone who thinks marriage is an inheritance strategy." Maggie leaned back slightly, exhaling. "Perfect." Edward paused, studying her. "Do you think he'll understand?" Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the skyline reflected against glass and cloud. "Eventually. He has to learn that love without discernment breeds blindness." That afternoon, she met Lucas at their usual cafe, a quiet place with soft jazz and no cameras. He looked tired, unshaven, his tie loose. The scandal had quieted online but still lingered in the form of half-deleted posts and awkward silences. "Mom," he said, sitting down. She's not herself. She says people won't stop bringing it up. She's thinking of suing some of the bloggers." Maggie stirred her coffee slowly. "Then she'll waste more of what she doesn't have." He frowned. Why did it have to go that far? You could have talked to me first." "I did," she said softly. "You weren't ready to listen." He looked away, his voice low. "I know. I just wish—" He stopped himself, his eyes flicking toward her hands resting calmly on the table. "She thinks you're cutting us off?" "I'm restructuring," Maggie corrected. "Not cutting off, redirecting, toward good that lasts longer than vanity." He swallowed hard. "So, that's it? You're rewriting the family legacy?" "No," she said gently. "I'm preserving it. You just don't like that it no longer includes her." He didn't argue. He didn't have to. The silence between them said enough. When he finally rose to leave, He kissed her cheek, murmuring a half-hearted, "I love you." She smiled faintly, replying, "I know, dear." Later that evening, back in her study, Maggie scrolled through her tablet. Vanessa's name popped up again. Another post, desperate and polished. A lengthy caption about forgiveness, rebuilding, and moving forward with grace. It was accompanied by an overexposed photo of her on a balcony, a glass of rosé in hand. The comments beneath were a mix of pity and skepticism. One follower wrote, "Grace doesn't erase deception." Another, "Funny how trust funds disappear when the truth comes out." Patricia called as Maggie read, "I see she's still performing." Maggie chuckled softly. "Let her. Some people only exist through applause." "So," Pat asked, "everything finalized?" "Completely," Maggie said. "If Vanessa wants a stage, she can have one. But the audience has changed." Pat laughed. "And Lucas?" "He's learning the cost of silence," Maggie replied. Outside, the evening light dimmed to gold. Maggie poured herself a small glass of wine and stood by the window, watching the city pulse below. For the first time in years, her reflection looked like peace. Not complacent, but earned. She set her glass down, picked up the final notarized document from Edward, and slipped it into her safe. As the lock clicked shut, a quiet certainty settled over her. The wealth she'd built, the dignity she'd guarded, it was finally insulated from deceit. She closed the safe, turned off the light, and walked out of the room. Her phone buzzed once on the counter, a new notification. Vanessa had tagged her in a post. The caption read, "Some people mistake control for grace. I pray for them." Maggie smiled faintly, typed a single comment beneath it, and hit send. "Control builds walls. Grace builds trust. You had neither." Then she set her phone face down, the glow fading to black. The week that followed was strangely quiet. Too quiet. The city had moved on to new gossip, new scandals. But Maggie knew that silence didn't mean forgetting. It meant digestion. People were still talking, just behind closed doors. On Wednesday morning, she sat in her study with her laptop open, the early light spilling across the oak desk. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad as she reread a short post she'd drafted for one of her private groups, a social circle of retired consultants, civic board members, and old colleagues. People who didn't trade in drama, but in information. The post was brief and surgical. Transparency matters more than appearances. Facts over fiction, always. For those who asked about the Carlton Estate's authenticity, I've attached public filings and verified documentation. The truth is often dull, but never deceitful. She attached a handful of records, property leases, trust registrations, tax filings, all scrubbed of commentary, all stamped with official seals. Then she clicked post. There was no thrill, no pulse of revenge, just quiet finality. Within the hour, the messages began rolling in. Old business acquaintances, community leaders, even one of the country club's board members, each with polite shock thinly veiled under professional phrasing. "Thank you for clarifying, Maggie. It seems the Carltons were aspirational, to put it kindly. We should have known you'd set the record straight." She closed the laptop, poured herself another cup of tea, and watched as the faint ripples of her action began to move outward. By afternoon, those private posts had been screenshotted, forwarded, and inevitably leaked into the wider Charlotte social web. Wedding guests started messaging each other, half in disbelief, half in relief. The whispers turned into exchanges of receipts, shared photos, and side-by-side comparisons of what Vanessa had claimed versus what was verifiable. Patricia called just before sunset. "You've done it again," she said, a grin audible in her voice. "Your post's gone further than you think. Half the people from that wedding are sharing those records through back channels." Maggie smiled faintly. They'll call it curiosity, not gossip. That's the polite way of feeding on truth. Pat laughed. You make it sound like a public service. In a way it is, Maggie said. Cleaning the record always is. By evening, social media had reignited. Someone had stitched together screenshots of Vanessa's old boasts about ancestral wealth, 3 generations of philanthropy, exclusive partnerships, and paired them with the now public records Maggie had posted. The contrast was devastating, and the comments were relentless. Vanessa's Instagram page, once polished and full of filtered perfection, had gone private within an hour, but the screenshots had already escaped her control. Around 9, Maggie's phone buzzed. A message from Lucas. Lucas. Mom, can we talk? Maggie. Of course. Lucas. I owe you an apology. 10 minutes later, her phone rang. His voice was tired, unsteady, but stripped of denial. I didn't want to believe it, Mom, he said quietly. I kept thinking people were exaggerating, but the papers. Her name's not even on half of what she claimed. Maggie said nothing for a moment, letting the silence carry the weight. You see why I had to, she said finally. I do. I just wish I'd seen it sooner. She softened, her tone almost maternal again. You saw what you wanted to see, Lucas. We all do, until the truth insists. He exhaled shakily. I've been thinking about taking some time apart from her. That's your decision, Maggie said. Just make sure it's made from clarity, not shame. A long pause followed. Thank you, Mom, he said at last, for protecting what you built, even if I didn't understand it then. When they hung up, Maggie sat in the stillness of her study for a long time. The night outside was clear, the storm long gone, leaving the air washed and new. Her phone pinged again, this time from Patricia. He called me. He sounded different, like he finally sees it. He does, Maggie replied. Sometimes the hardest truth is the one you have to see twice. Pat sent back a single line. You've won, without saying a word. Maggie smiled at that, glancing at her reflection in the darkened window. Winning was never the point, she murmured. Understanding was. She rose, closing her laptop, the glow of its screen dimming to nothing. Across the city, the whispers were still spreading, weaving through dinner parties and charity circles, turning speculation into conviction. But Maggie didn't need to follow it anymore. She walked to her cabinet, poured the last of her evening wine, and sat by the window. Outside, the skyline glittered like quiet applause. She raised her glass slightly toward her own reflection, toward the woman who had endured years of underestimation and turned them into her sharpest tool. Then she whispered, half to herself, half to the ghost of the evening she'd dismantled, "Let the truth live where lies once breathed." By the time the leaves began to turn gold along Charlotte's tree-lined avenues, Maggie Lawson's name had quietly returned to the circles that mattered. Not because she sought it, she never had, but because reputation, once wounded, had healed back sharper than before. A soft autumn light filtered through her kitchen windows that morning as she read the community newsletter folded neatly beside her teacup. A headline in elegant serif caught her eye. Margaret Lawson, Upholding Integrity in Business and Beyond. The article was brief but precise, written by a local editor she'd once mentored. It spoke of her decades as a business consultant, her philanthropic initiatives for women entrepreneurs, and her unwavering commitment to truth in leadership. It never mentioned Vanessa by name, but the timing wasn't lost on anyone. Patricia called before Maggie even reached the second paragraph. "Front page of the community section," Pat said, voice full of satisfied pride. "You're trending, in the respectable way." Maggie smiled faintly. "Then I suppose good manners still have their rewards." Pat chuckled. "Oh, they do. And if Vanessa's seen it, She's probably choking on her own perfume right now. Maggie didn't laugh, though her eyes twinkled. Let's not dwell on her. I prefer my victories quiet. But not everyone was quiet. Online, the contrast between Maggie's newfound praise and Vanessa's social decline had turned poetic. Once the darling of Charlotte's charity scene, Vanessa now found doors closed, events at capacity, and acquaintances conveniently out of town. The more she tried to restore her image, the more her desperation showed. Lucas remained caught in the middle. He'd moved into a downtown apartment, citing space, though everyone knew what that meant. He still visited Maggie once a week, tired, apologetic, trying to bridge the unspoken distance. On one such visit, he arrived with a strained smile. "Mom, they're writing about you now," he said, holding up the newsletter. "You're becoming a bit of a legend." Maggie poured him coffee, her tone mild. "Legends are for people who embellish their stories. I prefer accuracy." He nodded, staring into his cup. "Vanessa's been having a rough time. No one will meet with her. She says you ruined her reputation." "I didn't ruin it," Maggie said gently. "I revealed it." He looked up, eyes searching hers. "I think I'm finally starting to understand that." "Good," she said with a small, measured smile. "Understanding is the only form of inheritance that lasts." Later that week, Maggie stopped by Edward's office. He was already waiting with a neat stack of folders and that steady calm she trusted. "All filings are complete," he said. "Trust finalization, charitable reallocation, deed confirmations. Every clause, airtight. You now have full control of your assets and legacy, permanently." "Thank you," she said simply. Edward clasped his hands together. "You've done something rare, Maggie. Most people in your position act out of anger. You acted out of precision. It's cleaner that way." She smiled faintly. Anger burns fast. Strategy endures. As she rose to leave, Edward added, "One more thing. I had a call from an editor this morning, a national magazine, Women's Viewpoint. They're running a feature on female integrity and leadership. They want to interview you. Said your name came highly recommended." Maggie paused. "From whom?" He checked his notes. "A columnist named Marianne Beale. Apparently, she read your community profile and the commentary surrounding it. Said she admires your quiet power. Wants to discuss women reclaiming narratives from entitlement." Patricia nearly screamed when she heard the news that afternoon. "You're kidding." "A national feature?" Maggie, ever composed, only smiled. "They said they'd like me to write the piece myself." Pat pressed a hand over her heart. "Well, isn't that poetic? The woman who let the truth do her talking will now put it in print." "I'm not sure I'll accept," Maggie said, though the sparkle in her eyes said otherwise. "I've spent my life correcting lies. Writing about them might feel redundant." "Maybe not," Pat replied thoughtfully. "You've proven that exposing deceit doesn't have to be loud. Maybe women need to hear that from someone who's lived it." That night, Maggie sat at her desk, the autumn wind brushing softly against the windows. The newsletter lay beside her, the headline visible under the lamplight. She reached for a fresh page in her notebook, her handwriting still elegant, deliberate. Working title: "The Cost of Entitlement, When Truth Becomes a Woman's Quietest Weapon." She stared at it for a long time, then underlined it once. Her phone buzzed. A new message. From an unknown number. Unknown. Saw the article. Impressive. Must feel good to be the hero now. Maggie. Who is this? Unknown. You know, some of us don't fade quietly. No signature. But Maggie didn't need one. She leaned back in her chair, an amused, almost pitying smile forming. Vanessa's last spark, still trying to ignite a fire in ashes. Maggie deleted the message, powered off her phone, and returned to her notebook. Her pen hovered, then moved across the page again, the ink bold against the paper. Truth has no expiration. It waits, patient as I did. Outside, the wind lifted the edges of the trees, scattering golden leaves across her lawn, remnants of a season ending and another beginning. She looked out into the night, serene and certain. The world could whisper whatever it liked now. The narrative was hers, in writing and in legacy. And in that quiet, victorious glow, she allowed herself one deep breath of satisfaction before whispering the line that had become her creed. Some lies fall apart. Others I take apart, piece by piece. The first frost of November had settled over Charlotte, leaving a thin glaze of silver on the lawns and rooftops. Maggie Lawson sat at her writing desk, the soft hum of the radiator filling the stillness. Her notebook lay open to the same title she'd written days before. The Cost of Entitlement, When Truth Becomes a Woman's Quietest Weapon. But now, the words had evolved. It wasn't going to be a magazine feature or a national essay. It would be an op-ed, written on her terms. She began typing. Her fingers moved with a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. We often mistake wealth for wisdom and inheritance for integrity. But the truest measure of character is not what we acquire. It's how we behave when acquisition ends. Entitlement is a debt that compounds faster than interest, and those who live on illusion eventually default. The piece wasn't bitter. It was reflective, sharp, and deliberately measured, like every move she'd made in the months before. She referenced a recent social incident only in passing, weaving lessons on financial transparency, personal accountability, and the danger of mistaking display for depth. When she finished, she didn't publish it publicly. Instead, she printed 10 copies and slipped them into envelopes, addressed to Lucas, Edward, Patricia, a few trusted board members, and 2 local educators from the Women's Foundation she funded. By afternoon, she hand-delivered most of them herself. Her tone with each recipient was the same. Just something I've been thinking about. I'd value your thoughts. Patricia read it first. She called within an hour. It's elegant, Maggie, she said, voice warm. You didn't stab. You educated. You made truth sound like grace. That was the point, Maggie replied, smiling faintly. I don't believe in revenge anymore. Only correction. But the internet, it seemed, hadn't yet learned that lesson. The next day, Vanessa resurfaced online, her account unlocked, her captions defensive and full of subtext. She claimed that powerful people manipulate narratives and hinted at documents taken out of context. It was an attempt to claw back dignity, but the response was tepid at best. Patricia sent Maggie a screenshot of the comments. Girl, stop digging. Still waiting for proof? Maggie Lawson could teach a masterclass in patience. Maggie simply replied, The truth doesn't argue, Pat. And she meant it. Lucas stopped by that weekend. He looked different. More grounded, less frantic. The storm that had once clouded his judgment seemed to have finally passed. He lingered by the fireplace, a cup of tea untouched in his hand. I read your op-ed, he said quietly. It was humbling. Maggie smiled gently. Humbling is good for growth. He nodded, then added, I realize now that you didn't do any of this to embarrass her. You did it to protect what Dad built, and what you built. She looked at him, eyes soft. I did it to protect you. You just didn't see it that way yet. Lucas's shoulders sagged with quiet relief. I see it now. They didn't need to say more. When he left that evening, he hugged her tightly, something he hadn't done since the wedding, and for the first time, there was no resentment in it. That night, as the city lights blinked against the frost outside, Maggie and Patricia met for tea in her sunroom. The air smelled faintly of chamomile and wood polish. Pat set down her cup, smiling. You've managed to turn scandal into philosophy, Only you could make ethics trend. Maggie laughed softly. I wasn't aiming for trend. I just wanted clarity. Pat tilted her head. And what now? What comes after the truth? Maggie looked out the window, where the lights of Charlotte shimmered in the distance. Impact, she said simply. The Women's Fund is ready for expansion. I'll increase the scholarship allotment next quarter, especially for single mothers going into finance or business law. The next generation deserves a cleaner playing field. Pat grinned. So you're turning your revenge into reform. Call it redemption instead, Maggie said, for everyone who ever underestimated where quiet conviction could lead. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of rain beginning to tick softly against the windows. Maggie poured another cup, the steam curling upward like the faint ghosts of the past fading into the night. Her phone buzzed once on the table, a notification from Women's Viewpoint. Marianne Beale. Loved your op-ed draft. Would you consider expanding it into a longer piece for our January issue? We believe it could redefine how readers think about feminine restraint as strength. Pat leaned forward. What is it? Maggie smiled, the expression slow and knowing. Opportunity, she said, setting the phone down. As Pat raised her cup in a quiet toast, Maggie's gaze lingered on the frost outside. Every lie she had exposed had given birth to something better. Awareness, education, truth. And yet, beneath that peace, a flicker of something stirred, a sense that the story wasn't quite finished. Because people like Vanessa never truly stopped pretending, they only found new audiences. Maggie picked up her pen again, flipping open her notebook to a blank page. At the top, she wrote in careful script, Chapter 2, When the Entitled Try Again. Her smile returned, measured, certain. The restaurant glowed in the soft amber light of evening, warm, intimate, quietly elegant. A private room had been reserved at Maggie's favorite place downtown, overlooking the skyline of Charlotte. The occasion wasn't marked by banners or speeches, but by something far subtler, a gathering of peace. Patricia was already there, dressed in deep plum, her laughter the first sound that greeted Maggie as she entered. Edward followed a moment later, briefcase in hand as always, though tonight even he seemed lighter, almost relaxed. Around the table sat a handful of Maggie's oldest friends, people who had known her before the titles, before the scandal, before her name carried the weight of truth. Maggie took her seat at the head of the table. Her hair was pinned neatly, her navy dress understated, her pearls simple. She didn't need embellishment anymore. The room itself seemed to honor her calm authority. As the first round of champagne was poured, Patricia raised her glass slightly. To surviving chaos with grace, she said, smiling at Maggie. Maggie returned the gesture, her eyes soft. And to friends who remind you who you were before the noise. A ripple of laughter circled the table, gentle and genuine. The dinner unfolded easily. Warm bread, rich wine, stories that drifted between business and memory. No one mentioned Vanessa outright, though her shadow lingered at the edges of conversation, like the faint echo of a song long finished. At one point, the maitre d' approached and whispered discreetly to Maggie. Mrs. Lawson, someone asked to deliver this personally. He handed her a small envelope embossed with gold initials. She turned it over once before opening it. Inside was a single card. Wishing you well on your redemption tour. V. Patricia leaned over. She actually showed up? Maggie glanced toward the glass door. Outside, just beyond the threshold, Vanessa stood. She looked smaller than Maggie remembered, nervous, fragile in a way that had nothing to do with fashion or posture. Her lipstick was perfect, but her composure was gone. Lucas stood a few feet behind her, uncertain. Vanessa caught Maggie's gaze through the glass, lifted her chin as if to speak, then hesitated. No apology came, no words. She turned, her heels clicking softly against the marble, and disappeared into the night. Maggie let the door close behind her, the sound barely a sigh. Edward's voice broke the silence that followed. "Closure doesn't always announce itself," he said gently. "No," Maggie replied, folding the card and setting it aside. "Sometimes it just leaves when it realizes it no longer belongs." The conversation resumed, easy and unforced, though Lucas remained quiet when he joined them moments later. His face was pale, his eyes unreadable, but his posture carried a humility Maggie had never seen before. When dessert arrived, tiny glass cups of vanilla custard topped with caramelized sugar, Patricia nudged Maggie with a grin. "You're going to have to make a speech. It's tradition." Maggie smiled. "If I must?" She rose slowly, champagne flute in hand, and the room stilled. The city lights beyond the window twinkled like distant applause. "I don't have many words tonight," she began, her voice even but full. "Only gratitude, for friendship, for time, and for truth that endures when everything else falls away." She paused, letting her gaze pass over each face, the loyal, the steadfast, the few who had watched her weather every twist of the storm. "There was a moment, not so long ago, when I was told I didn't belong among the polished and the proud. That I was, in someone's words, low class." A murmur of recognition rippled through the group. Patricia's lips pressed into a knowing smile. Maggie continued, her tone steady but strong. "That phrase stayed with me, not because it wounded, but because it revealed. Some people mistake heritage for worth, presentation for value. I learned that success, the kind that lasts, doesn't need to shout. It simply stands, quietly, and lets results speak." She lifted her glass higher. "To truth, to patience, and to the quiet victories that make the loudest noise." The room broke into soft applause, glasses raised in unison. Lucas's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his own. His eyes met hers. Apology, admiration, and something close to awe shining through. Edward leaned toward her as the sound faded. "Everything's finalized," he murmured. "The trusts, the estates, the endowments, all locked. Your legacy is untouchable." Maggie exhaled, a serene smile crossing her face. "Good. Then I can finally rest my pen." Patricia laughed. "Until the next article calls." "Until then," Maggie said, her eyes glinting with quiet humor. The night wound down in laughter and warmth. When the plates were cleared and coats gathered, Maggie lingered a moment by the window. Outside, the city shimmered, alive, clean, renewed. The reflection that looked back at her was the same woman who had once stood in a ballroom and swallowed an insult like a stone. Only now, that stone had become the foundation beneath her feet. Patricia joined her, slipping an arm through hers. "You did it, Maggie." "No," she said softly, her eyes still on the skyline. "I just let the truth find its way home." They stepped back toward the table where the last candle flickered low, wax pooling at its base. Maggie lifted her glass one final time, her voice calm and absolute. "She called me low class," she said, her smile quiet but razor sharp. "I exposed her lies, and let my success speak.